Mr. Carl was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea and was looking thoughtfully out the window. From time to time, he looked at the clock on the wall inside, sadly dissatisfied with what he was seeing. The old man was sad because his son Simon and daughter-in-law Cheryl were staying late at work. This wasn't the first time it had happened, and thus Mr. Carl was becoming suspicious. However, Simon and Cheryl always had a logical and convincing explanation for their late arrival. According to the spouses, there was a lot of work in the company and therefore they had to stay in the office and work overtime. But Mr. Carl didn't buy it. The old man believed that his son and daughter-in-law were deliberately avoiding him. He thought that they just didn't want to spend time with the sick and emaciated old man that he was forced to ask his relatives to help due to his royalty. The fact is that Mr. Carl used to live alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. Just a year ago, the old man had a garden and a lawn, which he always kept it in impeccable order even despite his age. His wife died a long time ago and the man was used to dealing with this problem on his own. His life was fine until one day an unfortunate incident happened. Mr. Carl was out shopping and there was a fire in his old house. Unfortunately, the fire was impossible to notice in time and therefore in what seemed like the blink of an eye, the entire building was engulfed in flames. It's hard to say what exactly caused the fire, but firefighters who arrived at the scene kept saying it must have been a short in the electrical wiring. By the time Mr. Carl, laden with shopping bags, returned to the house, all that was left was smoke and embers. When the old man saw what happened in his house, he clenched his fists and the food fell to the ground. Mr. Carl was so shocked by what he saw that he immediately felt sick and passed out. The ambulance that arrived at the call and took the old man to the hospital where he was diagnosed with a stroke. Losing his house was a huge blow to Mr. Carl, and it turned out to be very difficult for the man to get over. Unfortunately, the stroke caused temporary paralysis of the limbs, which was even more of a problem than losing his house. Few people knew that more than anything else in his life, Mr. Carl didn't want to impose on his son's family, who moved him into his home as soon as he heard the diagnosis. "Son, you should have put me in the hospital or sent me to some kind of hospice. Why would you want such a burden in your life?" the old man said, trying to prevent Simon from seeing tears in his eyes. But Simon didn't want to hear any of that. He loved his father, and despite his diagnosis, both Simon and his wife were willing to care for Mr. Carl. Several months passed thanks to competent treatment and Mr. Carl's strong desire to get better. The movement slowly returned to the previous body of him, immobilized from him. At first, all he could do was wiggle his fingers and toes, and then, inspired by his success, he finally started moving his limbs, and the day he finally managed to get himself out of bed was probably one of the most important days of his life. And that's when the old man got the idea that he had to move out of his son's house and go live in a nursing home. Also, there was an elderly neighbor who added fuel to the fire. He kept telling Carl about his daughter and her son-in-law, who supposedly wanted to get rid of her as soon as possible, and we're just biding their time. "I get criticized all the time." He put the cup aside down. "I woke up too early and then woke up everyone else. It's a horrible way to live your life, so every day I sit and wait to be sent to a nursing home," the woman confided in her neighbor, looking sadly into his eyes. These conversations obviously make Carl feel bad for the rest of his day. Also, the old man saw that Simon and Cheryl had become more reserved recently, and for some reason he didn't know that. They started staying late at work and only came home after dark. "They must be upset with me. That's why they stay away from me and are too cowardly to tell me the truth," Mr. Carl thought, waiting for the couple to return home. Simon and Cheryl had been gone for a long time, and when the front door finally opened, the old man surprised the couple with the news of him right there at the door. "My dears, I thought and decided that I don't want to be a burden to you, so I just have one request sent me to a nursing home." "I beg you," Simon and Cheryl looked at each other anxiously, then lowered their eyes in embarrassment. "Well, it looks like I hit the mark with my request. Look at them." Lowering their eyes, the old man thought bitterly. But to his surprise, Simon took his hand and said, "Dad, let's talk about this later, okay? Now is not the right time for this conversation." Mr. Carl shrugged nonchalantly, making it clear with his entire appearance that he was not going to change his mind under any circumstances. The rest of the night was quite awkward as everyone felt tense. Simon and Cheryl were silent, each buried in their laptops. Meanwhile, Mr. Carl was eager to build on his success, so we kept talking excitedly about how good the nursing home would be for him. Of course, deep down, he really didn't want to part with his son's family. But on the other hand, he was afraid of being an inconvenience to his family. Therefore, the old man decided to be proactive, initiating the transfer of him to the nursing home to show that he was serious about his intentions. Carl even packed his suitcase so he could be ready to move at a moment's notice. But time passed, and for some reason, Simon and his wife were in no hurry to keep his promise and returned to the conversation about sending Mr. Carl to the nursing home. Finally, the old man became obsessed with his thought, so much so that he couldn't find peace of mind or calm down. Mr. Carl hoped that they'd let him work in the garden at the nursing home and maybe even plant some seeds and mow the lawn. The old man was very proud of the garden that he used to have in his house. Several weeks later, Simon finally informed his father that he could start preparing to move into the nursing home. So the turning point had come, Mr. Carl thought with a hint of sadness, but then he accidentally noticed Cheryl putting a new bedding set in a plastic bag. Moving the soles of her shoes, Mr. Carl went out into the street, where the first thing he did was say goodbye to his neighbor, informing him that he was moving to a nursing home. The old woman nodded understandingly, muttering that all children are the same. They're trying to get rid of their elderly parents as soon as possible. The next morning, the whole family woke up earlier than usual. After a quick breakfast, Cheryl and Simon loaded Mr. Carl's belongings into the trunk of his car and placed him in the backseat. Casting one last sad glance at his son's house, the old man silently wiped a tear from his cheek and closed the door. Throughout the trip, Mr. Carl kept looking out the window, trying not to miss the moment the nursing home would come into view. However, to Mr. Carl's surprise, the route suddenly became painfully familiar. The old man tensed noticeably, and when his son stopped his car right in front of his house, Mr. Carl almost fainted, fearing that his eyes were failing him. The old man began rubbing them in disbelief, trying to make sure he was seeing properly. But no matter what he did, what he was seeing didn't change. The old man opened the door and got out of the car with tears in his eyes. On the side of his burnt-down house, there was now a freshly painted new house. Mr. Carl carefully opened the door and entered the yard, which was littered with various building materials. Looking at the excited Simon and Cheryl, the old man understood everything without words. As it turned out, the spouse's long absence and late nights at work were due to the fact that they were working on the construction of the new house for Mr. Carl. Some things they did on their own. The construction team did other things. To say that the old man was happy would be the understatement of the year. All this time, Carl thought his family was looking for an excuse to send him to a nursing home. Realizing how wrong he really was, the elders hugged his son and his daughter-in-law. "Thank you, dear. This is the best gift anyone has ever given me," Mr. Carl whispered through tears. Simon and Cheryl just smiled back and then helped the old man unpack and put everything in order in the house. It was then that the new set of bedding came in handy, carefully purchased by the old man's daughter-in-law to make his new bed. Now, thanks to the efforts of his family, Mr. Carl returned to live in his old home and felt like an independent person and a member of a large family. Mr. Carl also learned that no one was offending her son's older neighbor and no one was planning to kick her out. In fact, the old lady has lived in that building ever since it was built, and she was just making up all sorts of conspiracy theories out of her loneliness and boredom. In this way, the old lady wanted other people to feel sorry for her and pay more attention to her. Carl now realized is that he shouldn't have listened to other people's speculations, but rather he should have drawn his own conclusions from it. After all, each person has their own life and their own problems, all of which have different solutions.